I didn't need anyone to give me any moral guidance on the topic. I didn't need for anyone to tell me to be good to animals, not to be cruel to them. It was just instinctive for me. And I think so many of us, especially kids, have this intuitive fascination and appreciation for animals. In fact, if you look at children's books, 90% of the images that you see in kids' books are animals. Kids learn about the world by looking at animals and seeing animals, and it is part of their process of human development. And I knew that animals were different. Obviously, they were different looking. They had beautiful fur, they had beautiful eyes, they were athletic, they ran fast. But to me, the differences didn't disqualify them from our moral consideration. They just enhanced them in my mind. And I knew that while animals were different in so many ways, they were our equals in one respect, and that was in their capacity to suffer. And while animals can't write a sonnet, or they can't do advanced mathematics, and they can't do a lot of the things that we as a species are capable of with this incredible brain that we have, they are deserving of our respect and decency and consideration. And I think it's in some ways because we are so different in some ways and so distinctive in some ways that it really does enhance our responsibility to be good to them. We should be good to the least among us. We should use power properly. In the relationship between humans and animals, we hold all the cards. We control their fate almost entirely. And how we choose to act, I think, is a basic test of our character. We can choose the path of harm and cruelty and exploitation, or we can choose the path of mercy and kindness and compassion. And that is the one that the Humane Society of the United States advocates, that these creatures share this planet with us. They are all part of God's creation. God declared that the animals are good. All that he created is good. We have a custodianship and a stewardship that is our responsibility as the most powerful species on the planet. And it is a tall order for us. But I believe, as I said, we have a head start because I think that there is this incredible bond that exists between humans and animals. And it's manifest in so many ways in our society today. There are 171 million dogs and cats in our households. We spend more than $45 billion a year on pet products and caring for our pets with veterinary services and the like. There are more than 70 million people who are wildlife watchers, spending billions of dollars a year watching the incredible feats of flight of birds and watching mammals and watching all of the creatures of the natural world. We now have Animal Planet on television. We have the Discovery Channel. The world of the non-human creation is so available to us now. The animals are in our homes, they are in our lives, they are in the books that we read, they're on television that we watch, they're in the fields when we go out to see them in our wildlife watching gambits. They are part of our lives. And there are people who say, well, a concern for animals is a frivolous sort of concern. There are more important issues in the world than animal issues. And I think one of the great things about the human spirit is its boundlessness in terms of our compassion. Our compassion is not finite. We don't have to say, okay, we're going to do this, but we can't do this. As a society, a civil society, we have to exhibit mercy and justice and principles of compassion in all that we do. We can't be selective in applying these principles. These are broader outlooks that we must have in society. And our goal at the Humane Society of the United States is to have people recognize that these other creatures matter. And I do believe that we've already won the basic debate. It is already well recognized in our society that animal cruelty is wrong. Here in Arkansas, thanks to Representative Adcock and others, it is now a felony. It is a crime to maliciously harm animals and to torture them. And really, I think if you look at the country, we're seeing this awakening. Arkansas became the 45th state to adopt felony-level penalties for animal cruelty. And there are certain types of cruelty, like dogfighting, where it's a felony in all 50 states, and it is a felony at the federal level as well. Cockfighting is a felony in 40 states. So as a society, we have already crossed this barrier. We have said, yes, human beings have a responsibility to other creatures. We should not exhibit malicious harm to them. The difficulty in our work now, and the challenge for all of us to think about, is how we apply these anti-cruelty principles more broadly in society. And do we exhibit this compassionate concern for all creatures? And how do we balance culture and tradition and habit and economics and honor all of those things that are important parts of our culture, but also fit the animals into the equation? But as I said, in taking on this task, I think that we've gotten a head start. There is a natural bond that exists between us and animals, and we're learning more about it. There's even now a biochemical explanation for the bond between us and animals. A lot of people thought it was just a sensitivity that people had, or that thought they were fascinating just because they're beautiful and interesting. But there's actually something that draws us to animals that is in our biochemistry. You know, there are certain animals that trigger fear responses. I remember when I was a kid, a mouse ran across the kitchen floor. And, you know, my mother was healthy. She could get away fine. I don't think the mouse was a threat to her. But she jumped on the chair, and she let out a sound that I'd never heard from my mother. And this was a programmed response in her. You know, we have some biological wiring that causes us to fear certain animals, rodents or snakes or spiders. I'm sure some of you have been there on these issues before. Predatory animals, you know, if you're hiking in Yellowstone or hiking in Glacier, you might think there may be a mountain lion or a wolf or a grizzly bear. So if that's kind of a plausible line of thought, that we have some biochemical explanation for these fear-based responses, there may be some explanations for our social attraction to other beings. When a mother bears a child, if you look at the hormone levels, you see that a hormone called oxytocin, which is called the bonding drug, is elevated in both mother and child. A mother can stare at the child for 12 or 14 hours a day. There is a biochemical explanation for the connection. It's not just this overall genetic or evolutionary explanation. There is something in the biochemistry. There is more and more research to show that when people interact with their dogs and their cats, we are releasing oxytocin as well. That there is actually a biochemical lift that we get. And we hear about taking animals to senior centers, and it calms the people in the senior centers. Our troops who've come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, so many of them who have post-traumatic stress disorder, so many of them have an animal. They get off their medications, they can get out of the house, they feared social situations, they feared even going to the grocery store. And it was animals and this connection that we have to them that has been the pathway for them to calm themselves and to feel better. Animals have healing properties and qualities, and I do really believe that this attraction that we have, there is something biochemical at some level with it. E.O. Wilson, the Harvard biologist, he has studied insects, but he's traveled all over the world. He's spent time in hunting and gathering communities, and spent time on almost all of the continents of the world. He says that we are naturally drawn to nature. He calls it biophilia. He says that we are drawn to life like a moth is drawn to the light, that there is an instinctive connection that we have with the natural world. And we see this in so many ways with wildlife watching, or hunters who appreciate nature and the natural world, being out in nature. These are all expressions of our modern human-animal bond. At one time, we were entirely immersed in nature. Before there was agriculture, before there was domestication, the human species was hunting and gathering. We needed to understand animals. We needed to understand their cues. We learned from the hunting behavior of wolves, and we learned about our own social behavior by studying other animals. And if you look at the remnant hunting and gathering cultures in the world, they are connected to other creatures, and they understand the natural world. And I think this is part of our modern legacy, that we are still so connected to creatures. And my thought is that the modern expressions of the human-animal bond, whether it's pet keeping or wildlife watching or the incredible amount of philanthropy that exists to help animals, those are just the modern iterations of something that has been with us forever throughout human history. The first barefooted steps we took on the planet, we were interacting and understanding animals. And the relationship has changed over time. 10,000 or 12,000 years ago, when we domesticated animals, we changed the relationship. You know, the greatest change in human history occurred with the domestication of animals. For 99% of human history, we were pre-agricultural, we were hunting and gathering. And when domestication occurred, that relationship changed entirely. And some might say while the hunting and gathering relationship with animals was a more egalitarian relationship, where we were kind of on the same plane, domestication changed that. We became the controllers of animals. We became more dominant over them. We controlled their breeding, we controlled their lives, we controlled their use. And while it's true that that allowed us greater control, there was also an element of nurturing, and there was also an element of husbandry and care. We gave life to these other creatures. We tended to these other creatures. Animal husbandry was part of the ethic in the relationship that we had with other creatures. That was a bond in its time. It was different than the bond that hunting, gathering cultures had with the animals that they hunted or that they watched or appreciated in some ways. Domestication changed that. It's really in the more modern era that we've had a greater degree of alienation from animals. And many social movements are born out of crisis. They're born because there's some major problem, that there's some excess that exists, and good people run into the breach and try to address it. And if you look at the origins of the humane movement, the movement to fight animal cruelty and to protect animals, you see that the first organization, the Humane Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, was formed in 1866. And what was happening at that time in our nation? Well, there were a few things going on. First, we had just dealt with the greatest moral crisis of the time, a moral crisis that lasted for centuries, that was finally resolved in this country with the end of slavery. And when the Civil War ended in 1865 and slavery was abolished in this country, we began to see the first stirrings in an institutional sense in fighting animal cruelty. So it was no accident that just 1 year after the Civil War ended, the first humane organization started. And then you saw throughout the nation local humane societies being formed in 1867 and 68, 69, 70. If you look all across the country at the local humane societies, so many of them had their origin right after the Civil War. But what else was going on at that time? It was the period of industrialization. There was a new relationship with the natural world. And it was, for the most part, a harmful and detrimental relationship. If you look at wildlife and what happened with wildlife in the 19th century, we had in the Great Plains of this country and even into the Rockies and the Intermountain West, there were bison, American buffalo. It was said there were 40 to 60 million bison roaming that great expanse of our country. And with the development of the repeating firearm and the transcontinental railroad, and also new markets for hides and tongues of buffaloes with the new emerging cities of our nation, we saw incredible exploitation of the bison. In just the period of about 3 decades, we dropped from millions of bison to just 500. They survived because Yellowstone National Park, the world's first national park, was created in 1872. and 500 of the animals survived in that park. Otherwise, they would have been exterminated. To think of this human destructiveness that occurred in such a short span of time, the largest mammal on our continent, so abundant, brought to the very precipice of extinction by this combination of factors, an attitude of domination with new technologies and new forms of commerce to liquidate nearly an entire species. They were not nearly as abundant as the passenger pigeons. There were billions of passenger pigeons. It was said by John James Audubon and others that flocks would fly over and darken the sky for hours on end because there were so many birds. It seemed that they were inexhaustible, but in the period of a few decades, they were entirely removed from the planet. The last one died in captivity in 1914. So the crisis at the time in terms of wildlife was that we were destroying it. We were liquidating wildlife. And the first conservation organizations had their origins at that time. What was happening in the cities was that there was exploitation of the horse. The horse was the main means of transport in our society. This was before, obviously before the internal combustion engine and before we had automobiles. And the way we got around was by using horses. But in the cities, they were being whipped, they were being overworked, they were overburdened, and the new residents of America's cities saw these abuses, and many of them wanted to do something about it. And this was really part of the origin of the humane movement. All of this new exploitation, this alienation from nature, the separation, where people were living in cities and weren't connected to the animals, and there were people who were profiting from the exploitation and harm of these other creatures. And since that time, this humane movement has been growing. And now there are more than 10,000 organizations devoted to the protection of animals. There are groups like the Humane Society of the United States that work on all animal issues. The ASPCA is another group. There are other broadly minded humane organizations. Some fight for the welfare of farm animals, others to try to phase out animal testing, others to stop the abuse of animals in entertainment, like the use of chimpanzees in movies or commercials. Others work on spaying and neutering, or homeless pet populations, or animal rescue, or feral cats. There are animal advocates for just about every species, and this is a great part of our country, that there is such pluralism in terms of philanthropy and charity and conscience. We have advocates for all species and all sorts of people, and that altogether, collectively, adds up to a humane society. We don't all have the same priorities. We don't all have the same passions, but together, when we work on all of these issues, we can build the foundation stones of a civil society. And it's unfortunate and it's sad in some ways that our society needs 10,000 animal welfare groups. Because if we really behaved in the proper way to begin with, and our conduct was good toward animals, we wouldn't need groups to fight for new laws. We wouldn't need groups to rescue animals in distress. We wouldn't need to find homes for animals without them. But that is the circumstance in our society. And I'm always struck by the incredible set of contradictions that exist in our society. We have these anti-cruelty principles. We have these 10,000 plus organizations. We have pet keeping and wildlife watching and Animal Planet and all the things that I ticked off before, all as expressions of the human-animal bond and of the connection we have with other creatures. Yet in this same culture, we have so much cruelty and abuse and exploitation. We have 100,000 people involved in dogfighting by our best estimates. We have many times more than that involved in cockfighting. Cockfighting, until the legislation that Representative Adcock passed, was a big industry here in Arkansas, and it still exists in pockets throughout the state. When we banned cockfighting in Oklahoma in 2002 by ballot initiative, the legislature didn't do it. We had to take the measure to the people. it was estimated that there were 2.5 million fighting birds in the state. There were 42 arenas, some with stadium-style seating with 12 or 1,300 seats for the spectators. Now, this was in 2002. We're not talking about 1940 or 1950, or certainly not 1840 or 1850. And there are lots of other threats to animals. I just got back from Missouri. I flew in this morning from Missouri, where there are 3,000 puppy mills in the state. And you know, this is an incredible thing to me. You think of all that charity and goodness toward animals and all the people working hard to help them. The greatest allocation of resources in the humane movement goes to sheltering and spaying and neutering and caring for homeless dogs and cats. There are 8 million animals who enter 3,500 brick and mortar shelters in this country every year. 8 million. 3.7 million of them don't come out alive. They're euthanized at these shelters because there are not enough adopters for these animals. And of the 3.7 million, 3 million of them are healthy and adoptable. There's no problem with these animals. They can make a great, loving companion. So in a society that collectively spends $2 billion on that problem, you add up all the budgets of all the private organizations, the local humane societies, the SPCAs, the rescue groups, plus the county animal care and control and the municipal animal care and control, which are government-funded programs, we spend $2 billion a year fighting that problem. In the same culture where we're trying to solve that problem, there are 10,000 of these puppy mills, and a good number of them in Arkansas. These are high-volume commercial dog breeding operations that treat the breeding moms like production machines and treat the puppies as a cash crop. And they sell them to pet stores, and they sell them now directly to the public through internet sites. And we raided 16 of these operations just in the last year, rescued 3,000 dogs from them. Our partners at the ASPCA and local humane societies rescued thousands in addition to what we did. And we've been on the site of these mills. Our state director, Desiree Bender, has been to many of them as well. The animals are often confined in cages, sometimes 2 by 2 cages. They're on wire cages, so the cages don't have to be cleaned. The manure and the urine will fall out. Sometimes they're stacked, which means that the animals on the bottom get the waste spilling upon them from the animals above. They're often exposed to extremes of heat and cold, during that time of the year. And they often don't get veterinary attention because these operations, as we've seen time and time again, cut corners to make profit from animals. And to me, I look at the numbers, those 10,000 puppy mills are churning out 2 to 4 million dogs for the pet trade. Well, what's that number of dogs killed in the shelters? It's 2 million. They are displacing animals who are in the adoption pipeline because people are often unwittingly making impulse purchases when they see a cute puppy in the storefront of a pet store. And so many of us have been involved unwittingly in this problem. I was involved. I told you how, when I was a kid, how much I loved animals. I had all the encyclopedias, dog-eared to the animal entries. I got National Geographic books. I had all sorts of animal books. I loved animals. And one of our dogs died, and my uncle decided, to kind of ease the pain that all of us were feeling, that he would get us a new dog. And he got us a beautiful West Highland Terrier we named Randy. And Randy was from Kansas, and we thought, wow, she's from Kansas. That's so exciting. We were from Connecticut, from New Haven, Connecticut. That was far away, and it was exotic. And I thought, well, isn't that great that Randy's from Kansas? And now I know that Kansas at the time was the largest puppy mill state, and it's the small breeds that are the dominant breeds of the puppy mills. And I look back and I think, what did her breeding mom go through, and what happened to all of these animals at the puppy mill? And Randy had her share of genetic problems. She had skin problems and all sorts of problems that we had to contend with for the rest of her life, but we did it. happily. We loved her. But ironically, the municipal animal shelter was within sight from my house. Stand on my front porch, and you look across this field, and there was a police-run animal shelter that I could see. There was a brick building, didn't have many windows, didn't look too inviting. I didn't even know what was going on. I didn't even know they were really adopting animals. I heard barking, I didn't know what was going on. So we got a dog from more than 1,000 miles away from a puppy mill when my new best friend was a quarter mile away, waiting for someone to adopt him or her, to give them a new chance at life. And that wasn't malice, that wasn't anything but ignorance. And you know, so much of the issues that we work on is not that people have a cruel heart, it's that we often don't know. We often don't know what the choices are. We think that because things have been done a certain way for such a long time that this is the way it's got to be done for the future. And you know, really more and more in our age where we have so many opportunities and we have this incredible mind capable of so much innovation, it's really a question of identifying choices and opportunities and recognizing that there is a major moral question before us in terms of how we treat animals. And if we can treat them better without diminishing the quality of our lives, without sacrificing what's important to us as individuals, as communities, as a society, then shouldn't we choose that path? I mean, if it's unnecessary to cause harm to animals, then shouldn't we do that? Isn't that the very definition of animal cruelty, is the needless infliction of pain on animals? You know, I look at some of the big issues that I've worked on. I think that there's an emerging consciousness in the country about them. I remember going down to Louisiana 5 years ago for the Katrina crisis. And, you know, this was a calamitous storm. It nearly, you know, destroyed a great American city in New Orleans, and it, you know, wiped away, at least temporarily, cities in Mississippi and other cities in the path of the storm. And it was a great human crisis. 1,100 people died. So many people were displaced from their community. They lost their jobs. They were separated from their families. There was so much distress. There was so much hardship. And we went down, because the government didn't have a plan to help the animals. We went down to help these creatures who were caught up in this storm and in the aftermath of it. And we went down there, and in the end, we rescued about 10,000 animals. We had 7,000 communications that came into the Humane Society saying, my dog or cat is trapped in a home. I evacuated. I thought I'd be back 2 days later after the storm passed, but the city was shut down. I can't get to him. Please do whatever you can to get to my animal. Break down the door, break the window, get inside and save my animals. And we were racing against time. With technology disrupted and transport and everything disrupted, we were racing, and thousands of volunteers rushed in to help us. And as we were doing this, I was talking to the press a lot. I thought that the first question that I'd hear is, you know, why are you concerned about the animals when there are all these people who are in this dire circumstance? That question never came. And for those people who were down there, whether they were part of the rescue response in whatever form, whether they were reporters, they saw that the fate of humans and animals was intertwined. And they actually saw over time, as we did, that a deficient government response to the animal crisis undermined the response to the human crisis. We saw time and time again when we saw fire departments and the Navy and other first responders go into the areas most afflicted to rescue people. And remember those numbers, 171 million dogs and cats. 2/3 of American households had pets. But the government had a policy that was a non-policy on animal issues. No instructions on helping the animals. No facilities for them, no mechanism. So the instruction to all these first responders, it was not their fault, was leave the animals behind. And when the Navy personnel or the firemen and firewomen put their hand out to rescue so many people, they said, thank you, I've been waiting, for 2 days or 3 days or 4 days for you to come to help me. I've been suffering, I've been in distress. And I've got my 2 German Shepherds and I've got 3 cats here as well. And they said, I'm sorry, ma'am or sir, we can't take the animals. And so many of those people said, thank you for coming for me, but I'm not abandoning my best friends during their greatest time of distress. And we saw how powerful that human-animal bond was, that people would sacrifice their health, their well-being, their comfort in order to care for what they considered to be their family members. And then they made incredible efforts to reunite if they were separated from them, and we flew animals across the country and people flew across the country to reunite. And it was an incredible teaching moment for America in terms of the interconnectedness of the human and animal experience, that they were not separate circumstances, and that, again, compassion and decency and mercy are not selectively applied. They are broad principles to be applied every single day of the year with all species all the time. And I also think of cases like we did an investigation at a slaughter plant in Southern California. It was called the Hallmark Westland plant. And we have been very concerned about the change in some agricultural operations away from the very noble traditions of animal husbandry and proper animal care and rearing animals in a responsible way for human consumption. And the industrialization, that same separation that occurred that I talked about with the bison and the passenger pigeons and that alienation from nature that allowed this overexploitation, I've been concerned about what's going on in industrial agriculture with some of the animals being in severe confinement systems or transported inhumanely or slaughtered inhumanely. So we looked at this slaughter plant. It was called a cull cow slaughter plant. And these are spent dairy cows. So these are dairy cows who have been producing milk for some time, maybe 2 or 3 years, and we've engineered them to produce enormous volumes of milk. And half of them have mastitis, and their udders are often hanging down to the ground. And these animals get lame very early in life. I mean, not the normal, range of not the normal age that they would live to as a healthy, genetically intact animal. So this plant specialized in slaughtering these spent dairy cows. And what our investigator found was that a good number of the animals arrived at the slaughter plant incapable of walking, or once they got there, they were incapable of walking. And they're called in the industry downer cows. They're literally down on the ground and they can't get up. They're wallowing in manure. And the responsible policy for a responsible farmer or proprietor of one of these slaughter plants would be to humanely euthanize animals who can't walk on their own into the facility. But this plant, the management had the mentality that there was no such thing as a downer. You could get all those animals up. So they instructed the plant workers to do whatever they had to do to get the animals up. And that largely meant causing them such distress that they would try to escape their tormentors. They rammed them with forklifts. They used hot shots on them, electric pulses from a little device, a little baton with an electrical charge, which they put in their eyes, their genital areas. They put water hoses in their mouth to create a waterboarding effect to cause them to feel like they were drowning, so the animals would get up and move away. And we documented all of this, and eventually we released it to the press. And it turned out that this slaughter plant was the #2 supplier of ground beef to the National School Lunch Program. 55 million pounds of ground beef from this plant. Now, we had seen in Europe that downer cows were nearly 50 times more likely to have BSE, or mad cow disease, than ambulatory cattle. And because they were wallowing in manure, there were greater chances of E. coli and other pathogens getting into the slaughter process on the equipment and cross-contaminating. This was not just an issue of animal welfare, although certainly shutting down that place was well justified just on the grounds of the abuse of the animals. There was a broader principle and a broader connectivity, because when you mistreat animals that way, you're not going to have safe food. And again, it was a teaching moment, I think, for the American public that we have to be good to animals. If animals are going to be raised for food, they should not be tormented in this way. And I also think about the Michael Vick case and dogfighting. Many of you undoubtedly remember what happened on Moonlight Road in Smithfield, Virginia. Michael Vick and several people involved with him were involved in an interstate dogfighting network. Now, most people at the time, not us, because we were fighting, Desiree and her colleagues, we're all fighting dogfighting, cockfighting all the time. We've known how big the industry is. But for most of the American public, they thought that this was a relic activity, that this is one of the morally settled questions that we didn't really need to worry about. If we've got other issues to worry about, that's not one. And Vick and his, ultimately his co-defendants, they were documented not just fighting the animals, but they brought some new terms into the American lexicon. They were culling animals who didn't perform well in game matches. So if a dog, when they were game testing them, just to see how they fought or how they rolled, as it's called, if they didn't do well, they would kill them. They bashed them on the ground. They electrocuted some of them. They killed them in the most barbaric ways. I mean, not just killing them, but tormenting them. And the American public, to a person, was appalled by this conduct. And Michael Vick, for that crime, rightly served 2 years in federal penitentiary. And I think in some ways it was another of those wake-up moments that, hey, we've got this fabulous athlete, a Pro Bowl quarterback, with so much going for him. Why would he sacrifice all of that? Why would he risk so much for something so frivolous? Why would he risk all of that just to watch dogs fight? And I think it was a reminder to all of us that there is something dark in the human spirit sometimes. There are these expressions of cruelty that exist, and it's so important for a civil society to check those excesses. And ironically enough, with Michael, I've actually come to be very friendly with him. And toward the end of his prison term at Leavenworth, he reached out and said through some of his associates that he wanted to be involved in anti-dogfighting efforts. And I didn't want to hear it. You know, I was like, this guy did the worst imaginable things to animals, and I didn't want any part of it. But I thought about it for a while after they left, after they made their presentation, said, please just visit with him and talk to him. He's very sorry for what he did. And I thought about, what are we about at the Humane Society? Are we about endless punitive treatment of people who do the wrong thing, even if they've already served their time? Or are we about making people better? I mean, I really believed he needed to serve time, and he did. But if he said he wanted to come in and help the problem, and we see the problem. You know, Michael Vick was never the end game for us. Ending dogfighting was the end game. And I felt that when he asked, I said, Michael, I talked to him, the first thing he did is he said he loved animals. He said he's always loved animals. And, there's a very fine line here. People who are involved in dogfighting, cockfighting, they're around animals all the time. They are fascinated by the animals. They value their tenacity and their athleticism. And they, in some corrupted sort of way, appreciate the animals. There's actually a bond there. It's just been badly corrupted. And he said he loved animals. I said, Michael, you don't love animals. You may be interested in animals, you may be fascinated by them, but you don't love them because you do not do that to a loved one. And I said, listen, I'm not interested in your doing a PSA or, having your name in a press release. If you really want to show that you're turned around and that you want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem, you'll go into communities where these kids are being drawn to pit bulls and to dogfighting at young ages, and taught by other peers and adult figures or older kids to fight these dogs. And you have incredible power as someone who's involved in this to speak to these kids and tell them that it's a dead-end street and that you can do better. And I've been pleased. Michael's been doing 2 events a month with us and has been speaking to kids in schools. And I think, this is the right outcome. And if Michael turns away and turns back to this or exhibits, some cruel behavior, I'll be the first one to call him out, and I told him that. But if he gets on a better path, then that is a good outcome for our society. It's a good outcome for dogs. It's a good outcome for these kids who are drawn into this world. And that is exactly the sort of work we should be doing at the Humane Society. Because when it comes to animals, we are all sinners. We are all sinners. Animal use is intertwined in our culture. We raise 10 billion animals for food, more and more of them on factory-style farms. We are buying products in the marketplace that were tested on animals. People wear fur. People engage in recreational activities that result in the death of animals. We are all involved in this. None of us has clean hands when it comes to this. The key thing for me and for HSUS is that we're moving in the right direction. Not that we're perfect, not that we have zero impact on other creatures of the natural world, but that we are alive to the suffering of other creatures, that we are alert to these problems, and that we're committed to doing something about it. And we're all working through it on our different pathways and our different paces. And I think, in some ways, it's so easy. And I was struck recently, there were some folks who came to Capitol Hill not too long ago, and they were advocating for sharks. Sharks are not the most cuddly creatures, but there are 100 million sharks killed every year in the world. Many of them for shark fin soup. They catch the shark, and while alive, they cut the fin off the shark and throw the rest of the animal, debilitated and now unable to swim and to die a languishing death in the ocean. They throw them back. And the principal use is shark fin soup, which is consumed in China and some other Asian countries, and even in Asian American communities here in the United States. So there were 9 people who came to Capitol Hill. 9 people who came to Capitol Hill to lobby for sharks. And all of these people had been victims of shark attacks. Chuck Anderson was swimming in the Gulf of Mexico, and he was enjoying the warm waters of the Gulf, and suddenly he felt something in the lower part of his body. A shark had bitten his leg and taken a part of his leg off. The shark came back, and he parried the second attempt, and then the third time the shark came back, he took part of Chuck's arm off. And there were 8 other people who came to Capitol Hill and advocated for sharks. Now, if there are any people who have a justified sense of outrage about animals, it would be these people. And you could understand why they would wish ill upon sharks of the world, just as a mere act of kind of emotional catharsis or vengeance even. And you would excuse it because of what these people went through. But to think that these people whose lives had been changed by these animals then came to advocate on their behalf, to me was such a powerful lesson about compassion and decency and other-centeredness. That they were victims at some level, but they were going to go on with their life. They were not going to harbor ill sentiments, and they were going to be part of the solution. They were going to try to do something to stop this destruction of animals in the oceans. And they had a conscience. And I think, my God, we have so many choices. We have so many moral opportunities when it comes to the treatment and care of animals. Every day we can make food choices, we can make product choices, clothing choices, recreational choices, choices of volunteerism, choices of philanthropy. So many choices. We have so many opportunities to do good for other creatures. Are we taking advantage of all of these moral opportunities in our lives? We all want to live a good life. We all want to be happy. We want to spend time with family. We want to do things that are personally satisfying to us, but we also are blessed with this sense of altruism, other-centeredness. Don't we all want to look back on our lives and think that we left a great legacy, that we did good for the world, that we reduced the quotient of suffering and cruelty that unfortunately is part of this world, but that we can reduce it a little bit or a medium amount or a lot? I mean, I think of that. When I was in Missouri, I was thinking, I told some of our Humane Society of the United States members, I said, you're going to look back on this campaign to curb these puppy mills, and 10 years from now on September, I said this last night, on September 15th, 2020, you're going to think that was one of the most important things that I ever did, that I relieved the suffering of 200,000 dogs who were languishing in these puppy mills, in these cages, overcrowded and squalid and exposed to the elements. And I think all of us have that opportunity. You know, another story I think of recently was, it really shows the capacity for change. You know, they're whales. We've had quite a relationship with whales as a species. You know, the United States was once the center of the global whaling industry. As recently as 1961, there were 66,000 whales killed across the planet. Now, these are the biggest creatures that have ever been on this planet, bigger than the dinosaurs. And I mean, to think of killing 66,000 of them in a single year, I mean, it's just a staggering number. And we've been involved in fighting the Japanese and the Norwegians and the Icelanders on commercial whaling. The United States has a laudable and morally right position of opposing commercial whaling. And we work through this international convention, the International Whaling Commission. The nations of the world gather and we lobby them to urge an end to commercial whaling. But there's a quota that's given in the United States for native hunters in Alaska, Inuit communities and others, to kill a few bowhead whales. Now, these bowhead whales are, as adults, more than 50 feet long. They weigh more than 50 tons. I mean, it's twice as long as a school bus, and the weight exceeds it. I mean, it is a marvel of nature. These are incredible creations of God. And this community, they went out and they harpooned a whale a couple years ago. And when they were dragging the whale back in and they began to carve the whale up for meat, they realized that they were not the first people to have hunted the whale. Embedded deep in the flesh of this whale was a portion of a bomb lance that had last been used before 1870. And it's only recently that we have learned that whales can live 150 to 200 years of age. And this whale was hunted sometime in the 1850s or 1860s, it was estimated, and had survived that attack. Before Edison invented the light bulb, before Teddy Roosevelt was president, this whale was learning his migration routes. And the whale passed the entire 20th century without further harm, dodging the whalers throughout the world, dodging orcas, and survived the entire century, only to be killed in 2007 by this native community. And while in many ways it's a deeply tragic story, and I certainly wish that whale had not met that fate, I also think about the change that's occurred in the lifetime of this one living creature. That when this creature was in his early years, there were no humane organizations. We were in a period of kind of unrestrained exploitation of the natural world. We didn't have but a handful of laws against animal cruelty or other malicious forms of animal treatment. And in the life of this whale, we've seen 10,000 organizations emerge to fight for the defense of other creatures. We've seen countless millions of hours of sacrifice and billions of dollars devoted to make the world a better place for these other creatures. And in some ways, there's a hopefulness to it. We do not live in a static society. Our society is changing. The moral standards that used to be dominant have been washed away when they were wrong. And we as a society are getting better. We are doing better. We are treating our fellow man and woman better, and we are treating the other creatures of the planet in a better way. And that is our moral responsibility. And we are so creative and innovative as a species that this is within our grasp. We can do better, we can be better in the care and treatment of animals in all the realms that they are used. And it will not only flow back to the animals, it'll flow back to us. Because you cannot compartmentalize cruelty. And you also cannot compartmentalize or box up kindness. When there is less cruelty to animals, there will be less cruelty in the world. When there is more kindness, when we teach our kids about kindness, when we exhibit kindness in every application of our lives, we will be better at being kind. It is a training program for all of us living in a civil society. And in my position, I see the best of humanity, and I unfortunately see the worst of humanity. I see hearts that are cold and dead to the suffering of others. And when we're involved in a dogfighting raid, 9 times out of 10, those people are not just involved in dogfighting. They are involved in human-on-human violence or drug trafficking or other criminal behavior. When we go into a house and see domestic violence toward an animal, it's the animal one day, it's a child, another day it's a spouse the other day. 75% of cases with animal cruelty in a domestic setting, there's also spousal or child abuse. These issues are all tangled up together. Just like during Katrina, when we saw all of us bound together down there, that is our circumstance in society. So being good to animals is not just good for animals, it is good for us. And that is our pathway as a species. That is the moral direction in which we should run, not walk. Thank you very much.
Got some time for a few questions, so if you have one, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Yes, right, yes, sir, right over here. Wait for the microphone, please.
What would it take to get federal legislation passed to ban the e-commerce of dog and cat selling from puppy mills and that? How hard would that be? And
yeah.
I imagine one complicating factor would be, I don't advocate this either, but letting people actually post their own litters, that they have unwanted and they want to, hand out the animals and not make that a crime, somehow.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a great question. With 171 million dogs and cats in our households, and I mentioned that 8 million dogs and cats in shelters, hopefully we're going to get down to a zero euthanasia circumstance soon in our society, and hopefully the number of animals coming into shelters is going to decrease because we're going to teach people to handle animals better. People relinquish animals because of behavioral problems or other problems, so we're going to get better. So the number of animals in shelters is going to decline, and that's going to mean that we're going to need animals from other sources. We need responsible pet breeding. So we're going to need breeders out there. What we want to distinguish between are the people who are doing it right and the people who are doing it wrong. And a puppy mill, there's no strict legal definition of it. In my mind, it involves someone who kind of has lost the connection with the animal. A breeder can have an intimate connection with an animal and love the animals and breed them. There's no conflict there. But when you turn them into a cash crop and you just think of them as a commodity, that's where that separation occurs. And then you get volumes where it becomes kind of a factory farm for dogs. So I think the action is really going to be in the states. In Missouri with the ballot initiative, Prop B, it's going to be voted on November 2nd. So if you have friends in Missouri, please tell them to vote yes on that. And if we pass it, a lot of them are going to try to move down to Arkansas, and we're going to need puppy mill legislation here in Arkansas. So I hope the legislature will take that up.
Wait, she's bringing you the microphone. Wait for the microphone, please.
Hi. So I guess that was my question is, what do we need to do in Arkansas to be more help? Is it money? Is it volunteering? Is it lobbying for puppy mills? I mean, what can we do?
Yeah, the number one, I mean, I think, everybody can be a help to this in multiple ways. One way is to, if you want a new dog or cat, especially when we're talking about dogs here, go to a shelter or rescue group to get a dog and give these animals a new chance. They are often in shelters, they're vaccinated, they are getting more loving attention, so they're better socialized, they're getting better medical treatment. The puppy mill dogs are reproductively intact, so you need to get them spayed or neutered to pay for that. They're often sick because they're not getting veterinary attention, and they're not getting any human behavioral attention, so they often have behavioral problems. So I think number one is, get a dog from a shelter or rescue group and save a life, and then we can shrink as consumers the demand for these animals, and they won't rear as many of them. But ultimately, we need a policy solution. We have to have standards that relate to breeding, and animals should not have to stand on wire cages. They should not be stacked. They should have some opportunity for exercise. They should have some outdoor access so they can move around. They should get visited at least once a year by a veterinarian. So they're basic standards, and they're embodied in the proposition that we're now supporting in Missouri. And I really think with dogs, there needs to be a limit as to how many there are. If you have 50 intact animals, that takes an army to care for them. And, these animals are domesticated for human companionship. They should be in our lives and not stuck out, on the back 40 somewhere.
Okay, Frank, right back here at the back.
Thank you very much. Glad you're here today, and I hate to confess it, but I've actually cried more for the loss of some pets than I have for some people I've known. So I really related to Hillary's introduction. I found that neat. There's no advertising game, Mr. Pacelle. I see your advertising on TV, and it's very effective advertising. I see images of cats and dogs, and you can sell subscriptions to be supporters of the organization. My impression is that, at least what I thought was that it was somehow impacting. And so my question to you is, and by the way, congratulations on building a big business. I was looking at this report, $130 million in revenue. It's successful. How much of those revenues do you actually turn back to local shelter organizations for the spay and neutering that you spoke of earlier and for the local needs?
Yeah, the Humane Society, because it takes on some of the tough issues. We take on some of the practices in agriculture and puppy mills and dogfighting and seal clubbing. We've got our share of critics. And our critics try to caricature our position. And they caricature it by saying, well, the Humane Society of the United States, they should just be giving all their money to local animal shelters. That really, the implication is that we should just be a pass-through operation, that we should take donations in and put them back toward the shelters. Well, I say to people, I say it all the time, give to your local shelter. That is a very important thing. Give directly. There's no reason to pass it through us. Give locally. And that's where you get a couple of $1 billion in philanthropy donated to shelters. So it doesn't make sense to give it through us. Now, we do give some grants to shelters, but what we really do is we work to professionalize the entire field of animal welfare and animal protection. We host the nation's largest trade show for shelters. We publish the magazine for them called Animal Sheltering Magazine. We have our Humane Society University and give training to them. We use our resources much more effectively helping shelters professionalize their operations. But we also, so many times shelters are swamped when there's a big cruelty case, dogfighting or cockfighting or puppy mills. So we've done recently 41 deployments with our emergency response team, saving thousands of animals. Now that doesn't go through a shelter, but we're saving those animals. That is animal protection work. The flaw in our critics' argument is that the only legitimate work you can do for animals is to give money to a shelter. We have to operate in multiple ways. We're for all animals, protecting all animals, not just animals in shelter. If you look at all of the animals at risk in society, there are 10 billion animals raised for food. There are hundreds of millions of animals used globally in animal testing. There are billions of wild animals at risk. 8 million animals in shelters. Now, that's very important. We devote a large share of our resources to helping shelters. But if we did just that, that would be a terrible dereliction of duty because they represent less than 1% of the animals at risk. There has to be a group that looks at the big picture, that is working to prevent animal cruelty, not just to respond to animals once they're in distress or once they're homeless. We do that more than any other group. We have 5 animal care centers, we have a veterinary division, we have an emergency response unit. We spend millions on direct care of animals. But I will never allow our organization just to do that. We have to attack the root causes of cruelty. And all the things that I talked to you about and many more are the things that we focus on to protect billions of animals.
Ryan, we have a question.
Hi, I'm Ryan Adams. I'm a student here at the Clinton School. Thank you very much for coming. You were talking about this capacity of suffering and how terrible animal cruelty is. And I think there's a strong acknowledgement of that amongst people for dogs and cats. But there still seems to be this huge disconnect when it comes to the animals that we eat. And I know that the Humane Society has taken a really strong stance in the last few years on factory farming. I was just wondering if you could talk about that a bit.
Sure. We do agree with you that all animals deserve respectful treatment. And culturally, we may be drawn more to certain animals than others, and individually, we may have our favorite animals. But as a moral question, they are all equals when it comes to suffering. And in some ways, I know Senator Byrd of West Virginia talked about this a great deal before. He said, animals raised for food, we not only have a responsibility, but we have an added responsibility toward them, precisely because we raise them for food, precisely because we're using them for that purpose. Should we be subjecting them to lifelong confinement in small cages or crates that inhibit their ability to even turn around? Should we be transporting them by inhumane means, long distance without relief from suffering? Should we be slaughtering them with the line speeds going faster and faster where the animals are taken apart before they are alive? These are questions that grip the Humane Society of the United States, and we are working hard on them, whether it's downer cows or humane slaughter or stopping these most intensive confinement practices. We are very committed to it, and I'll tell you that more and more the public is very conscious of its food choices. The public wants wholesome food, but they want food that does not come from animals who are not treated well. And it doesn't, our argument is not that individual farmers who are using these industrial systems are cruel people. Far from it. This is the way the industry has gone. These have become norms within the industry. What we're questioning is the continued industry practices, and we want to move the industry toward more humane systems. So one thing that we can all do, for instance, in terms of our egg purchases, is buy cage-free eggs. Rather than have the hens in a battery cage, under the standards for the egg industry, the birds are in a small wire cage called a battery cage, and the battery cages go a long row. That's why they're called a battery of cages, and they're stacked, sometimes 3, 4, 5, 6 high. And the birds are group housed, so they're in these cages, they're jammed in, so there are 4, 6, or 8 birds in the cage, roughly. And under the industry standard, each laying hen gets 67 square inches. So 95% of all birds in the industry get 67 inches, and if they're not compliant with the industry standard, a little bit less. But this is an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. What's 8.5 times 11? For your math whizzes, come on, 93 square inches. This is 93 square inches. Fold it over 1/3, that is 67 square inches. That is the living space that the laying hens have for the 12 to 18 months that they're alive. Now, this is not a question of eating animals or not eating animals, or eating eggs or not eating eggs. This is about decency. This is about giving animals built to move the opportunity to move. And we are calling on consumers and policymakers to examine these questions, as difficult as they are. The agriculture lobby is very, very important. to the state of Arkansas. It's important to every state's economy, to varying degrees. And farmers produce incredible volumes of food that have relieved a lot of human privation. And there has been such an admirable effort to innovate and to do better in terms of production. Now we need to use that same spirit of innovation and creativity to keep production going well, but also to honor animal welfare. And I think we can do it. And I have enough confidence and faith in farmers that they can do it.
And we have a question right up here.
Hi, my name is Angel Whalen, and I was wondering, do you think that genetically engineering animals for mass production of food is cruel? And if so, what is the Humane Society doing about that?
I'd say that we're most concerned at this point with cloning of animals for food. And, cloning has proved thus far to be a very imprecise method of production of animals. And cloned animals have, time and time again, whether it's the first sheep that were cloned in other species, they've had all sorts of physical problems. They have abnormalities, they have shortened lifespan, they have chronic suffering that they experience. So I think we're very concerned about that. I think genetic engineering is here to stay. And I think that we can use science in a way to improve animal welfare, improve production. I think we just need balance when it comes to it. And we need to be careful about what we're doing. We've seen technology be provide so many great advances for our society, but we also have to be mindful of not allowing technology to outpace morality. And we need to make sure that we're traveling on parallel tracks.
Got time for one more question. Yes, ma'am, right there.
Hi, I'm Kiana Dixon. I have a question about pit bulls and your opinion on them. About a year ago, I went to adopt a dog out of the shelter, and all the pit bulls were in the back, and they're like, well, if you leave here, you can't get them. And, they get euthanized because nobody can adopt them. And I know that there are, a lot of people think, oh, they're just mean by nature, but some people think it's nurture. I have a pit bull. His name is Petey. He's the sweetest person. The sweetest dog ever. He won't hurt a fly. And I'm just, okay, no, right? To me, he is. But anyways, what is your opinion on pit bulls, and what are we doing to, like I said, all of them are getting euthanized because nobody can adopt them. You know what I mean?
I think that animals are really malleable when it comes to how they behave. And I know when I was a kid, I'm a lot older than you, but when I was a kid, the dog that was the bad dog or the aggressive dog was the Doberman Pinscher. And it was the German Shepherd before that. And after them, it was the Rottweiler. And if you look at kind of the cultural descriptions of animals and the fads that exist, you have people drawn to certain animals for the wrong reasons. They may want to fight them, they may want them kind of as a walking weapon or a display, they may want them as a guard dog. And I think it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. There is nothing inherent in pit bulls that causes them to be aggressive. There are pit bulls who walk around our office every day at our headquarters in Washington, D.C., and I feel 100% comfortable around them, and I deal with pit bulls all the time. It really is about how we treat them and socialize them. I'll tell you that even animals confiscated from fighting operations, now we do individual evaluations of them. Not long ago, we euthanized all of them, thinking that their genetics and their training made them kind of very difficult to deprogram. But now we are even changing our policies to address that issue. And I think that, in some urban shelters, 60 or 70% of the dogs are pit bulls. Now, that may be because the other animals go faster and the pit bulls stay longer, but there are lots of problems with pit bulls because people are making the wrong choices. So we're trying to turn around that perception of them as a bad dog, because they can be fabulous dogs. And I can tell you love your pit bull a lot.